When people picture the scariest puncher in heavyweight history, most fans jump straight to Mike Tyson. Explosive, blindingly fast, gone before you even registered the punch was coming. But ask the handful of men who actually stood in front of George Foreman, and they'll tell you there's a different kind of terror, one that's arguably worse. Because with Foreman, you could see the punch coming. You knew it was on the way. You could get your gloves up, brace, do everything textbook defense tells you to do, and it wouldn't matter. The punch would come straight through your guard, through your arms, and into your skull like you'd been hit by a moving vehicle. That was George Foreman's gift. Two of the men who pushed Muhammad Ali to his absolute limit, men considered among the toughest heavyweights ever to live, couldn't survive 4 combined rounds against him. Joe Frazier had gone the full 15 rounds with Ali and beaten him. Foreman put him on the canvas 6 times in under 6 minutes, at one point lifting a 200-plus pound heavyweight champion clean off his feet with a single uppercut. Ken Norton was, if anything, tougher. He'd broken Ali's jaw in their first fight. Against Foreman, none of that mattered once he got trapped on the ropes. In that period of boxing, nobody was asking if Foreman would win a fight. The only question was how long his opponent would remain conscious. At just 24 years old, he dropped Frazier 6 times in under 2 rounds to become heavyweight champion of the world. 2 decades later, at 45, with his speed and stamina long gone, he needed exactly one short right hand to knock out a reigning champion 19 years his junior. That's the George Foreman story in a nutshell, raw force, stripped of anything unnecessary. But this isn't really a story about how hard the man could hit. It's about something stranger. How did the very same fists that once broke him mentally end up being the thing that carried him back to the top of the boxing world 2 decades later? George Foreman came up in Houston's 5th Ward, one of the roughest corners of Texas, where poverty and violence weren't exceptions, they were the norm. The Foreman that later generations knew, the grinning grandfather selling grills on television, bore almost no resemblance to the kid who grew up there. That kid was volatile. He was dangerous. He fought because fighting was the only language that let him push back against the shame of being poor. Most people tried to avoid trouble on those streets. Foreman ran toward it. Landing a punch on somebody, even for a second, made him feel like something other than a kid the world had already written off. Everything changed when a coach named Doc Broadus introduced him to boxing as a teenager. Suddenly, the same rage that had been getting him into trouble was being applauded. Throw those punches on the street, you end up in a cell. Throw them in a ring, you end up on a podium. But there's a catch nobody warned him about. Anger can turn you into a monster fast, but it doesn't teach that monster discipline. Nobody around Foreman really clocked how dangerous that gap would eventually be, and honestly, neither did he. His time learning the sport was almost laughably brief. The 1968 Olympics in Mexico City were right around the corner, and while other fighters had spent years grinding toward qualification, Foreman basically walked in off the street with 2 lethal hands and blitzed his way to the final. At 19 years old, he was an Olympic gold medalist in the heavyweight division. His form was rough. His experience was minimal, but none of that mattered much when most of his opponents never lasted long enough to expose those gaps. That early success planted a dangerous idea in his head. If one punch didn't finish the job, the next one would. Years down the line, Ali would figure out exactly how to exploit that belief and hand Foreman his first defeat. But before that fight ever happened, there wasn't a single heavyweight on the planet who seemed capable of withstanding him. What made Foreman's power so unique wasn't just brute strength, it was how he applied it. He'd shove those thick forearms into an opponent's guard first, break their positioning, throw off their balance, and then unload from a range so tight the other guy couldn't even generate real leverage on his own punches. It wasn't pretty, but it was devastating. He didn't need a clean shot to the chin to do damage. Catch the gloves, and the gloves get driven straight back into the opponent's own face. Catch a shoulder, and the whole arm goes numb. Catch the body, and the ribs lock up along with everything underneath them. Most power punchers hunt for gaps in a defense. Foreman just demolished the defense and the man behind it in the same motion. That's what made him so overwhelming. Once he closed the distance and started breaking down your guard, it felt inevitable that you'd end up on the canvas. Through his first 40 professional fights, Foreman went a perfect 40-0, with 37 of those wins coming by knockout. But it was the Frazier fight that really put the fear of God into the boxing world. Frazier was undefeated at the time, the reigning heavyweight champion, the same man who'd handed Ali his first professional loss in the fight of the century. His pressure, his bob and weave, his suffocating left hook, that style had dragged plenty of dangerous punchers into fights they couldn't win. Going in, a lot of people figured Foreman was too green, too inexperienced, and that Frazier would be the one to finally expose him. Instead, in round one, Foreman landed an uppercut that sent Frazier's whole body up off the canvas. That wasn't a stumble. That wasn't a stagger. It looked like the champion had been launched. Frazier got up. He came forward again. He went down again. Up, down, over and over, 6 knockdowns inside 2 rounds. The man who'd gone 15 rounds with Ali and beaten him suddenly looked fragile against Foreman. But while everyone else in the arena was just stunned by the violence of it, Ali was watching something else entirely. He saw the floor hiding inside Foreman's biggest weapon. Foreman trusted his power so completely that once he sensed he could finish a man, he'd keep throwing until his gas tank hit empty. The theory was simple enough on paper. Finding someone willing to actually test it with their own body was another matter. A year later, Ken Norton tried and failed to provide an answer of his own. Norton, the man who'd broken Ali's jaw and battled him across 3 separate fights, couldn't survive past the second round against Foreman. Foreman used those forearms to frame him up against the ropes and just kept firing until the guard collapsed entirely. Norton wasn't merely losing exchanges, every block was draining something out of him. By the time the finishing blow landed, his legs were technically still holding him up, but his eyes had already gone somewhere else. One man beat Ali, another broke his jaw. Combined, they didn't survive 4 rounds with George Foreman. So heading into Zaire, nobody was asking whether Ali could beat this man. Everyone wanted to know how many minutes he'd last. Only Ali seemed to understand the real solution. You don't run straight at a mountain and expect it to move. You find a way to make it collapse from the inside. That's exactly what turned the Rumble in the Jungle into one of the smartest performances the sport has ever produced. When the fight started, Ali did something that left the entire arena confused. He abandoned the footwork that had made him a legend, planted himself against the ropes, brought his guard up high, and just let Foreman hit him. Shot after shot crashed into his arms, his shoulders, his body, the ropes themselves. People at ringside were screaming at him to move. He didn't. Instead, he tied Foreman's arms up in the clinch and started talking, asking him if that was really all he had, if that was the best he could do. Against most fighters, that's just noise. Against Foreman, it was gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Historically, whenever Foreman felt a man starting to break, one more violent burst always finished the job. So every time Ali absorbed a shot and kept talking, that internal voice telling Foreman he was one punch away got louder and louder. Just one more, just a little harder. He'll go down. But Ali was never actually targeting Foreman's chin in those early rounds. He was targeting his mind. And the harder Foreman swung, the more ragged his breathing got. The more desperate he became, the sloppier his technique got. Those punches landing on arms and shoulders and ropes might have looked like waves hitting a seawall, but round by round, Foreman was burning himself out. By round 8, the bulldozer that had steamrolled through the division looked exhausted. Ali came off the ropes, fired a tight combination down the middle, and for the first time in his career, the man who'd launched Frazier into the air went down himself. That loss cost Foreman more than a title. It shattered the core belief that had built his entire identity, that enough power could solve any problem in front of him. Ali needed 8 rounds to prove that power alone, without anything else behind it, can be turned into a weapon against the man throwing it. Foreman didn't come out of that loss humbled. He came out furious, throwing blame in every direction, his corner, the conditions, anyone but himself, while refusing to admit Ali had simply outthought him completely. His next major fight, against Ron Lyle, barely resembled boxing at all. It was 2 exhausted machines trying to figure out which one would break first. Lyle dropped Foreman. Foreman got up and dropped Lyle right back. Defense went out the window entirely. Whoever had a clearer head at that moment threw the next haymaker. Foreman later said Lyle's punches didn't just hurt, they felt like his brain had briefly disconnected from his legs. He survived that war and won in the 5th round, but the Ali rematch he wanted so badly never materialized. He beat Frazier a second time. Still no rematch came. That unfinished business sat in his chest like a hook that dug deeper the longer it stayed there. Then in 1977, after a loss to Jimmy Young, Foreman had a terrifying experience in his locker room, one that felt, to him, like brushing up against death itself. That moment changed the trajectory of his entire life. The man who'd once lifted Joe Frazier off his feet, who'd carried nothing but violence into every fight, felt genuine fear for the first time, not fear of getting hit, but fear that he might not open his eyes again. He turned to his faith after that night and walked away from boxing completely for a full decade. He became a preacher. He opened a youth center for kids in his community. He traded the scowl for a smile and eventually, publicly, admitted that the younger version of himself had been a genuinely difficult person to be around. Here's the strange part, though: when the anger finally left him, the punching power didn't go anywhere. A decade later, Foreman shocked everyone by announcing his return to the ring. He was closing in on 40 years old. His weight had ballooned past 300 pounds at points. He was noticeably slower, visibly heavier, and the media treated the whole comeback like a punchline. Even people close to him worried younger fighters would seriously hurt him. What most of the outside world didn't grasp was his actual motivation. This wasn't about chasing a paycheck or reliving old glory. His youth center was struggling financially, and the kids depending on it were at risk of losing that space entirely. The man who'd once earned his living with his fists had to put the gloves back on to protect something that mattered more than his own legacy. Early on, people laughed. Then his first comeback opponents actually felt what he could still do, and the laughing stopped fast. This older Foreman didn't chase people down with fury the way he used to. He moved slowly, methodically, using that lead hand to touch, prod, and crowd an opponent's guard, patiently steering them exactly where he wanted them. He'd happily lose rounds early on because he'd finally learned something his younger self never understood. You don't need to dominate every second of a fight. You only need one moment, delivered in exactly the right spot. Where young Foreman chased his openings, old Foreman simply waited for them to be handed to him. 3 years into that comeback, it all paid off. At 45 years old, he stepped in against Michael Moorer, the undefeated 26-year-old champion, faster, sharper, and nearly 2 decades younger. Foreman absorbed round after round, patiently waiting, until in round 10 he found the opening and dropped Moorer with one perfect shot, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. Moorer was the one who hit the canvas that night, but what Foreman really put to rest was the ghost of Zaire that had haunted him for 20 years. Looking back at it all now, what made Foreman so frightening was never just the power in his fists. Tyson's danger came from speed and angle colliding in an instant. Foreman's power felt more like the ground shifting beneath your feet, something ancient and unstoppable. In his youth, it could send champions flying. At 45, it could still make the entire division nervous, but the real transformation was never in his hands. It was in the man behind them. Young Foreman threw every punch trying to prove something to a world that had doubted him, and that need to prove it is exactly what Ali exploited to beat him. Old Foreman didn't need to prove anything to anyone in a hurry. He could sit patiently for 10 rounds waiting on a single moment. The same uncontrolled force that once cost him everything became, 20 years later, the thing that finally brought it all back. So who really hit harder, George Foreman or Mike Tyson? There's probably no clean answer to that one. But if the question is whose punch felt more like an unavoidable natural disaster, whose power could still shake an entire era 2 decades after his prime had passed, it's hard to look past George Foreman. Tyson terrified people because you often never saw the punch coming. Foreman terrified people because you saw it, you braced for it with everything you had, and it still didn't matter.